So it has come to my attention that Square Enix remade Final Fantasy VII recently. However, I won't be playing it. Not because I've sworn some vow against the remake out of spite, but because it's a timed exclusive to the PS4 and I've only got my souped up gaming PC here. Such is the burdens of the PC Master Race. Instead, I'll be tackling the one Final Fantasy game I've actually completed. That's right, get ready to whip out your blitzball and laugh like a madman because it's time for my review of Final Fantasy X Remastered. The crux of the game, as one might expect from a Final Fantasy game at the time, is that it's a turn-based JRPG. You have your pick of different kinds of magic items, physical attacks, buffs, items, and summons the works. Of course, unlike Final Fantasy 7 through 9, it lacks that menu timer when you're in battle. This might not be the most popular opinion, but I actually drastically prefer it that way. I think a turn-based RPG that forces you to rush your attacks without thinking too much trips over itself too much, like Doom 3 trying to be survival horror and shooter at the same time. With that in mind, this definitely makes Final Fantasy X more fun to play in my opinion. I should probably mention that after a certain point in the game, you can play something called Blitzball, but I could never really get a grasp on it. More noteworthy though is that you gain access to a ship and can fast travel, making going back and picking up things a whole lot easier. Leveling up operates on a system called a sphere grid, where you spin different types of spheres. Every character has their own little sphere grid space, and each space does a variety of things from improving a stat to learning a new ability. You can even use a rare friend sphere to put one character into another's grid, and apart from specialty moves, learn anything there. There's actually a method to use this to essentially make one of the characters stupidly OP, which brings us to the characters themselves. Tidus, the main character, specializes in sword and time attacks. His main unique ability is to flee battle. Auron is a samurai who basically specializes specifically with sword-based physical moves. Kamahri is a lancer and has some interesting things like absorbing enemy techniques. Wakka tends to specialize with blitzball-based attacks that can cause status effects typically. Lulu would be the black mage, specializing in strong magic attacks. Riku is pretty interesting herself. She can use specific Albad items like potions and can steal items from enemies. She can even use this to essentially hack robotic enemies to destroy them. Finally, we have Yuna. She specializes as a white mage with the ability to summon Aeons, but as I mentioned, has the ability to become brokenly OP. I learned from someone else that she actually has a lot of magic power, and using a friend sphere to take her to Lulu's space results in a very powerful black/white mage. Obviously, for best results, you'd want to hold off on this until Lulu can access her most powerful magic attacks. And of course, this is all in addition to summoning Aeons that can take and deliver a ton of damage. And on the subject of Aeons, they're separate characters that show up when summoned, essentially replacing the team until they're dismissed or fainted. They have their own overdrive moves that can emphasize attack at the cost of defense or vice versa with boosts and shields. The first one you get is called Veilfor, a dragon-type Aeon. It has a sonic wing attack that can delay enemies as well as a very hard-hitting energy ray overdrive. Ifrit is the second, specializing in mainly fire attacks and has an overdrive called Meteor Strike as well as a second one, Hellfire. Ixion is the third, specializing in lightning attacks, and its overdrive Thor's Hammer can remove protections from the enemy. Shiva is able to use ice-based magic and can actually heal herself if you set herself as the target. Her overdrive is Heavenly Strike, which can stun her enemy. Bahamut is the final and most powerful of the Aeons, striking hard and having an impulse attack that hits multiple enemies at the cost of having fewer turns. Mega Flare is its ultimate overdrive ability. In addition to all the mandatory Aeons, there are a few optional ones. Anime requires completion of each cloister trial and is actually demonstrated earlier in the game by Seymour. In addition to hitting hard, she has Pain, which can insta-kill enemies. Her overdrive is called Oblivion and strikes several times. Perhaps the most interesting of the Aeons is Yojimbo. He's essentially a mercenary and you have to pay a pretty penny just to get him. When he's summoned, rather than picking from attacks, you have to pay Gil and he'll choose his attack. If you offer him nothing, your relationship with him goes down and he uses power moves less often. Your relationship with him also goes down if you dismiss him without having him attack or if he's taken down. You can actually give him as little as one Gil and not have his relationship altered, but don't expect a high chance of stronger attacks. Diagoro, his weakest move, has his dog attack. Kozuka is essentially his middle-of-the-road standard move using throwing stars. If RNG smiles upon you, he'll use the deadly Zamato, rushing with his blade and cutting enemies horizontally in half. This is of course instant death for every enemy in the entire game, which I had to use to kill a Dark Aeon. The Magus Sisters make up the final Aeon and you need the others to unlock them, but I never acquired them personally. Apparently you give them suggestions rather than direct commands, so they're even less predictable than Yojimbo. Apart from that, the typical Final Fantasy mechanics apply, of course. Healing items are damaging to undead and a certain boss in the mountains will exploit this. Don't use elemental attacks against enemies immune to them because you can end up healing them rather than hurting them. It's certainly a game that demands strategy from you, and I like that aspect of it, even as my stupid self is getting owned up and down. The difficulty curve is technically all over the place. The penultimate final boss is actually impossible to lose to. Still, it's a very solid turn-based RPG, and I'd love to see future Final Fantasy games use this kind of formula. Since Square Enix seems to be going all in with real-time beat-ups though, probably not.
I thought it would be sadder somehow. Maybe I've gotten used to farewells.
You're stronger now.
The plot is actually fairly interesting, if a tiny bit predictable at times. Since I actually quite enjoyed the plot as a whole, this is a spoiler alert. You'll want to experience this game for yourself. Seriously, that moose if you didn't experience it already. Are they gone yet? Good, moving on. It all starts with a boy named Tidus who was a star player at a very eccentric game called Blitzball. This is all cut short by a catastrophic event after which he and Auron must fight through creatures to try to escape. This massive entity, known creatively as Sin, engulfs them. He awakens in the ruins of a temple where he finds himself under attack by a monster. The good news is that he's aided by a group of strangers, but the bad news is he can't understand them and is captured by them. Their leader, Riku, can speak his language, however, and explains that they're Albed, people who use the oh-so-dangerous and forbidden machines. So yeah, it's one of those kind of stories. The kind where technology is demonized by a religious ideology, kinda getting sick of those. In any case, they seem to think Tidus is crazy because he mentions he was from Xenarkin, a place destroyed 1,000 years ago by Sin. If you're starting to get a Futurama vibe because 1,000 years ago, trust me, it gets even better. Tidus agrees to accompany Riku on an airship salvage so that he can stay, but Sin sweeps him away again, off their ship. This time, Tidus finds himself on a beach where he finds a group playing blitzball. Showcasing his skills to the locals, the leader named Wakka is impressed and wants him to join their team. They haven't won a single game in 23 years, and Wakka's gonna retire to become a guardian, a warrior tasked with protecting a summoner. Much like with the Albed, they think Tidus is nuts when he mentions being from Xenarkin because, destroyed 1,000 years ago. Wakka takes Tidus to Besaid Village and into its temple where he learns Yuna hasn't returned from her trials yet. And of course, Tidus goes charging in despite the priest telling him not to and runs into her guardians Kamahri and Lulu. Along with Wakka, they make it to the Chamber of Faith just as Yuna's stepping out of it. How convenient. Now able to summon her first Aeon, Valfor, they head out on a journey to defeat Sin. Tidus is taken along to see if anyone at Luca will recognize him because Blitz Tournament. Yuna tells Tidus about how a man named Jecht helped her father 10 years ago as his guardian. Even though Tidus was supposedly from 1,000 years in the past, it makes sense later. Sin ends up appearing again and smashing Kalika Port, so Yuna guides the lost souls into the far plane. Basically the afterlife, since they might turn into fiends if they're not guided. After that, they enter the Kalika Temple and Yuna can now summon Ifrit. Making their way to Luca, Yuna learns that Auron is there and wants to go look for him. However, she's kidnapped by Albed's Blitzball team, all to force the Aurochs into surrendering the match. Tidus, Kamahri, and Lulu head to the ship to rescue Yuna while Wakka goes on to win the match, ending his losing streak. How the next match goes is up to the player. I'm bad at Blitzball, so of course we lost. During the rescue, Tidus learns that Yuna is in fact half Albed. Afterwards, fiends attack and Auron appears to help the main group stave them off. Seymour, one of the overseers, summons Anima to handle the rest of them. Auron tells Tidus that they beat Sin 10 years ago and that Jecht is now Sin, but Tidus isn't having any of it. Along the way, Yuna admits they're headed to Xenarkin to obtain the final Aeon to beat Sin. The Albed team up with the Crusaders in an attempt to beat Sin using Machina. This goes about as well as you'd expect, but to their credit, they did actually make Sin sweat a little bit. The group heads to Joe's temple for Yuna to gain the Aeon Exian and learn from another summoner of a rumor that summoners have been disappearing. Yuna's abducted by a Machina, but is saved by Tidus and Wakka before running into Riku, the Machina's pilot. Riku joins the party with Wakka kept in the dark about her Albed blood, and they head to Guadasalam, city of Guado, with Seymour as its leader. Seymour wants to marry Yuna, but she doesn't give him an answer and instead heads to the far plane to send off Seymour's father, Jiskal. Yuna ends up receiving a sphere recording from this. Tidus can't summon the image of Jecht in the far planes, lending further credibility to the claims that he's now Sin, but he accidentally summons his mom in the process. They learn at the Thunder Plains that Riku is afraid of thunder, and in Rin's travel agency, Yuna listens to the sphere recording. She soon decides to accept Seymour's marriage proposal. Fighting through a movie sphere that Jecht left behind, they head through Mechalania Woods. Seymour's brother Tremel leads Yuna to Mechalania Temple for the wedding, but an Albed group led by Riku's brother tries to stop it with a crawler. Of course, the team proceed to dispatch it. Wakka learns that Riku is Albed and pouts, walking the way there while the others take sleds. It comes to life when the discard is Sphere recording that Seymour iced his father, so the gang along with Yuna's new Shiva are forced to kill him. Trammell destroys the evidence of the assassination and takes Seymour's body before Yuna can send him. The team now have to flee Guado City, branded as traitors. Yuna planned to marry Seymour under the condition he turned himself in for his crimes. The gang realize they're standing on top of Sin, who is listening to Hymn of the Faith, and this is what finally convinced Tidus that Sin is his own father. They arrive at Baikonur Island and Yuna's gone missing. Riku leads them to the Albed city of home, which is under attack. Tidus then learns the horrible truth that the summoner loses their life in exchange for Sin's temporary defeat. They make their way to Fahrenheit, the airship Tidus helped Riku salvage back in the ruins, and make their way to Bevel. There, Yuna is in a wedding gown to be married to Seymour, who is essentially an unsent corpse at this point. The others crash the wedding and Yuna tries to send him off, but is stopped by the threat of her friends being held at gunpoint. Yuna threatens to jump off the tower and is forced to do so, but summons Valifor to take her to safety. Riku uses a flash bomb and the group all gets away. Auron reveals to nobody's surprise that the believers of Yevon are hypocrites and Yuna gains the Aeon Bahamut. The group is arrested and Grandmaster Mika reveals in a trial that he too is unsent. Auron confirms that Sin always returns to someone else and they escape, but Seymour appears with Koenig's body. He reveals his plan is to become Sin and end all life to stop the cycle, taking the Pyreflies from Koenig's body to transform himself, but is still beaten. In a spring, Tidus tells Yuna he knew about the final summoning and tries to convince her to abandon it. However, Yuna can't just let Sin run wild, so Tidus embraces her and they kiss. Now determined to save her, the group is off, but must face an even stronger Seymour in the mountains. Making their way to Zanarkand's remains, Lady Yunalesca, who was the previous summoner and is now an unsent, greets them. They learn that a guardian has to be sacrificed and become the final Aeon. Yuna refuses, but Yunalesca attempts to kill her, believing that she'll fall to despair. It's revealed that Auron is an unsent and Yunalesca is beaten, but before she disappears, she mentions that Yeva will just make a new Sin even if they manage to beat it. It's revealed that whenever they pierce Yevon's armor of Pyreflies, Yevon possesses the Aeon and makes it the new Sin. Mika is made aware of the final Aeon now being impossible to make and despairs, allowing himself to be sent. The group forms a plan to have all of Spira sing the Hymn of Faith to distract it and attack it with a Fahrenheit. This actually works and Sin opens his mouth as they make their way inside. They have to fight Seymour one last time, and finally Yuna sends him. As Seymour goes, however, he says that he believes that Spira is now doomed to despair. Tidus meets Jecht, who is briefly free from Sin's control. The 1,000-year, 10-year disparity is finally addressed as Jecht reveals he transformed what remained of Zanarkand into faith. He used their collective dream to make the false Zanarkand into physical form, similar to how an Aeon works. Defeating Jecht and finally laying his soul to rest, they now have to fight Yevon as it possesses Yuna's Aeons one by one. Somehow they manage to defeat all the possessed Aeons and Yevon is forced out into the open. It's a bug-like creature which fits well with its parasitic nature. They manage to actually stop Yevon and stop the cycle of sin once and for all. Auron has Yuna send him now that his mission is done and Tidus begins to disappear. Yuna tries to stop him but can't and he sees Braska, Auron, and Jecht waiting in the far plane. Yuna gives a great big speech to Spira about how Sin is gone for good and they can finally rebuild. Somehow Tidus appears in the ocean and swims up to the surface. I'm sure whatever that symbolizes is explained in X2, but I never played it. In any event, the story is over. For the most part, I rather enjoyed the game's twists and turns. I felt Seymour hung around a bit too long, especially when he technically dies in their first fight, but you know how incensed go. Tidus was also a tad too whiny at times, but I get why he is, and I'm sure the emo protagonist wasn't as overplayed back then. If I have another nitpick, it's that I don't really like the whole religion versus technology thing. I just feel that by now it's a bit too overplayed. Still, it was a nice story, and learning that Sin was Jecht was an interesting revelation. As I mentioned in the beginning, it was a little too predictable at times and even a bit convenient in its final solution, but it's still a pretty good plot. Final Fantasy X was very aesthetically pleasing even on the PS2, but the default resolution of 416p and especially low-res textures have not done it any favors. Fortunately, the Remastered edition really helps to rectify this. Greatly improved texture quality, full shadow casting, anti-aliasing, and ambient occlusion all serve to make a beautiful game look even better. The remaster actually uses the Fire engine, which was made by Sony. Perhaps the one element slightly out of place here is the polygon count, since they weren't increased. Still, it's not like it's terribly distracting, and it began the PS2 era of Final Fantasy games. That meant that in addition to having much higher polygon counts across the board, it doesn't rely on pre-rendered environments like the PS1 FF games had. The visuals during a fight can likewise be pretty breathtaking, especially the Aeon summonings. Two very notable ones for me are Anima and Yojimbo. Anima looks like she's being dragged out of another plane of existence via chains, while Yojimbo actually has an interesting fake-out. It looks like the big dog is the Aeon until you see the badass-looking samurai creature walking in from the distance. It also has some very beautiful imagery of a moon reflecting off of a pond and cherry blossoms falling off of trees all throughout it. It's pure eye candy and definitely accentuates his amazing power. If you pull off a Zamatu, it will always slice the enemy in half no matter what it is, although less than symmetrical enemies will appear to have been shaved off the top. The game also makes use of pre-rendered cutscenes, and I'd say they're pretty similar to what I said about the Chaos Theories cutscenes in that they've aged, but they certainly hold up much better than the PS1 era. Final Fantasy VII in particular had pre-rendered characters that look straight up funny in retrospect. FF10's cutscene faces actually look a tad uncanny with the increased detail, but it's nothing too distracting. The remaster also has its own remixed versions of music, but it's debatable what they actually improve or worsen the experience. Thankfully, the game gives you the option to use the original music, which is what I went with. It's not like the PS2 era desperately needed a music overhaul. Even the PS1's high-capacity CDs at the time allowed for quite good audio quality. Jecht's theme actually surprised me. Hard metal isn't something you expect in Final Fantasy, but it is awesome. I haven't heard the original Japanese voices, so I can't comment on that, but the English voices fit the characters well enough in my opinion. People have used Tidus' laugh as an indictment against the voice actor, but the Japanese voice sounds silly too, and that's kind of the point. I think Tidus was trying to sound silly and awkward on purpose. Overall, the game is quite pleasing to the eyes and ears. The sound effects are absolutely amazing to listen to, and the voice acting kept me invested. The remaster does the job it needed to do, greatly enhancing the game without completely having to do it over from scratch or losing any of the charm. All in all, I have to say that Final Fantasy X proved to be a very enjoyable experience. It's still a JRPG, so my idiot self was at a loss sometimes, but it never felt unfair. The difficulty curve was a bit wavy, with the fight with Seymour in the mountains actually being significantly harder than his final appearance, but that's not really a big deal. I know this isn't saying much, but personally I consider this game to be my personal favorite of any of the Final Fantasy games I've actually tried. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who likes turn-based RPGs and somehow didn't play it already. Thank you for watching my review. Consider this the final part of my Final Fantasy X review. Oh well, can't win them all.